Deep in the tangled heart of the Maine woods, where the pines whispered secrets to the wind and the ground swallowed footsteps like forgotten promises, stood the remnants of the Follings homestead. It wasn't much to look at anymore, a sagging roof patched with moss, windows like empty eyes staring out at nothing, and a porch that creaked under the weight of years. But once, oh once, it had been alive with the sounds of a family that no one in town liked to remember. The Follings, Elias and Martha, with their 12 children gathered from God knows where, each one arriving on a moonless night, bundled in silence and shadow. Elias was a tall man, gaunt as a scarecrow, with hands calloused from chopping wood and eyes that seemed to see right through you. Martha, his wife, moved like a ghost herself, her voice soft but laced with something sharper, like the edge of a hidden blade. They kept to themselves, those Follings, far from the prying eyes of the village below. No school bells rang for their kids, no doctor visits marked in any ledger. And the children, pale little things with wide, watchful gazes, they played in the underbrush, their laughter mingling with the rustle of leaves, but always stopping short when strangers approached. It started with the whispers, folks said. Not from the townspeople, no, those came later, after the disappearances. These were voices in the dark, drifting from the woods like smoke from a dying fire. At first, Elias dismissed them as the wind playing tricks, or maybe the owls calling to each other across the canopy. But Martha knew better. She'd lie awake in the loft, listening as the murmurs grew clearer, naming things that shouldn't be named, lost souls, stolen lives, the price of a family built on lies. The children heard them too, huddled under their quilts, eyes squeezed shut against the night. One autumn evening, as the leaves turned blood red and the air grew thick with the scent of decay, Elias found the first clue in the old well out back, a sodden scrap of paper, yellowed and crumbling, with no names, no dates, just a scrawled warning, "They have no beginning." He burned it that night, the flames licking higher than they should, casting shadows that danced like demons on the cabin walls. But the voices didn't stop. They seeped into dreams, twisted memories, until the Follings' world began to unravel thread by thread. Little did they know, the mystery hidden in those woods was older than the trees themselves, a macabre tapestry woven from desperation and darkness, where birth records were the least of what had been erased. And as the nights grew longer, the family would learn that some secrets weren't meant to stay buried, they clawed their way back, hungry for the light. In the dense, unforgiving wilderness of northern Maine, where the forest stretches like an endless sea of shadowed green and the nearest town is little more than a faint memory down a rutted logging road, a solitary figure pushed through the underbrush one crisp autumn afternoon. Dr. Evelyn Harrow, a historian in her mid-40s with a reputation for chasing the forgotten corners of American folklore, had come here on a whim born of obsession. For years, she had pored over yellowed newspaper clippings, dusty county archives, and whispered tales passed down in local bars, stories of families that vanished from record and memory alike. But this lead felt different. A faded map, discovered in the attic of an abandoned library, had marked this spot with a single, cryptic notation: Follings' voices carry far. Evelyn had always been drawn to the anomalous, the gaps in history where official narratives frayed and something darker peeked through. Her colleagues dismissed her work as fringe, but she knew better. The past didn't always leave neat footprints. Armed with a backpack stuffed with notebooks, a digital recorder, and a thermos of strong coffee, she had parked her weathered jeep at the end of an overgrown trail and set out on foot, guided by compass and instinct. The air grew cooler as she delved deeper, the canopy thickening until sunlight filtered through in thin, golden shafts that danced across the forest floor like wary spirits. Hours passed in near silence, broken only by the crunch of leaves under her boots and the occasional call of a distant crow. She paused now and then to consult her map, tracing faint lines that might have once been paths. Doubt crept into the woods had a way of swallowing certainty, but then, through a break in the trees, she spotted it, a structure half reclaimed by nature, its outline barely distinguishable from the surrounding pines. The cabin emerged slowly, as if reluctant to reveal itself. Vines snaked up its weathered logs, and moss carpeted the roof in thick, velvety patches. Evelyn's pulse quickened. This was no modern hunting shack. The construction spoke of another era, hand-hewn timbers, a stone chimney blackened by decades of smoke. She circled it cautiously, noting the absence of any recent tracks, no tire marks or trampled grass to suggest visitors. Only the wind stirred the branches overhead, carrying with it a faint, almost imperceptible murmur that she dismissed at first as imagination. Stepping onto the creaking porch, Evelyn felt the pull of discovery sharpen into something keener, almost urgent. The door hung ajar, warped by time and moisture, inviting her into the gloom beyond. Flashlight in hand, she crossed the threshold, the air inside thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. Dust motes swirled in the beam of her light, illuminating cobwebbed corners and the remnants of lives long interrupted. And there, scattered across a rough-hewn table, lay the first fragments of the enigma that would consume her, faded photographs of stern-faced adults surrounded by pale, solemn children, and papers yellowed with age, hinting at a family whose very existence seemed to defy documentation. As she lingered in that forgotten space, the woods outside seemed to hold their breath, and the whispers she thought she'd imagined began to weave through the trees once more, soft, insistent, calling from the deepening shadows. Evelyn's flashlight beam swept slowly across the cabin's single main room, cutting through decades of dust that hung in the air like suspended ash. The place felt less abandoned than frozen, as though the last occupants had simply stepped outside for a moment and never returned. A cast-iron stove crouched in one corner, its pipe choked with cobwebs. A rocking chair faced the cold hearth, its runners worn smooth by countless hours of motion. But it was the table in the center that drew her forward, its surface cluttered with objects that seemed deliberately left behind, waiting. Photographs first caught her eye, sepia-toned images in cheap cardboard frames, edges curled from damp. She lifted one carefully, the glass cool beneath her gloved fingers. A stern couple stood rigid before the cabin's porch, the man tall and angular, his face all sharp angles and hollow cheeks, one large hand resting possessively on the shoulder of a woman whose eyes held a quiet, unsettling intensity. Around them clustered children, 12 in all, arranged in uneven rows like mismatched dolls. The youngest could not have been more than 3, the oldest perhaps 14. They wore plain, handmade clothing, faces pale and expressionless, staring directly into the lens with an unnatural stillness. No smiles. No playful glances sideways. Just those wide, unblinking eyes that seemed to follow her even as she tilted the frame. She set it down and reached for the papers scattered beside it, loose sheets, some torn from ledgers, others handwritten in fading ink. Birth announcements there were none, nor baptismal records or school enrollment forms that might have been expected for such a large brood. Instead, she found grocery lists in a cramped feminine hand, tallies of firewood cords, and cryptic notes about new arrivals dated years apart, each marked only with a single initial and a season. C. Autumn 1947, M. Winter 1951. No surnames, no places of origin. One sheet, thicker than the rest, appeared to be a draft letter never sent, addressed to no one. They ask too many questions in town. Better to keep the children close. The woods understand silence. Evelyn's breath clouded faintly in the chill as she arranged the photographs in a rough timeline based on the children's apparent ages. The same couple appeared in every image, barely aging across what must have been a decade or more, while the children accumulated like layers of sediment, 1 or 2 added per photograph, never subtracted. She counted again, always 12 in the later images, but the faces shifted subtly, as if some had been replaced. A girl with a distinctive braid in one frame vanished in the next, substituted by another child whose features echoed hers faintly, like a poor copy. The floorboards groaned softly under her weight as she moved to a shelf above the stove, where more papers lay bundled with twine. Dust cascaded down as she pulled them free, hand-drawn maps of the surrounding woods marked with circles and crosses, a child's primer filled with careful, uneven lettering, and, tucked at the bottom, a small stack of blank certificates, the kind once issued for births or adoptions, their official seals faded but intact, every line left unfilled. No names. No dates. Nothing to prove these children had ever entered the world through any recognized door. Outside, the light was failing, the golden shafts through the windows turning bruised and purple. Yet Evelyn lingered, compelled by the growing certainty that the Follings had not merely lived here, they had hidden here, curating their family in deliberate secrecy, erasing any trail that might lead back to wherever these silent, staring children had truly come from. The cabin's walls seemed to lean inward, holding the weight of that absence, and in the deepening quiet she became aware of how completely the forest had closed around her, swallowing the path she had taken, leaving only the scattered relics on the table as evidence that the Follings had ever existed at all. Evelyn sank slowly into the rocking chair, the wood groaning as if reluctant to bear her weight, and spread the photographs and papers across her lap under the narrowing beam of her flashlight. The cabin had grown darker in the short time she had been inside, the last traces of daylight bleeding away through the grimy windows, leaving only the cold glow of her light to illuminate the faces staring up at her. She had come prepared for anomalies. Folklore often left ragged edges in official records, but what she found here was not a gap. It was an absolute void. On the long drive north she had stopped at the county clerk's office in the nearest town, a squat brick building whose records stretched back to the 19th century. A helpful deputy archivist, smelling faintly of coffee and cigarette smoke, had pulled the ledgers for her without question when she mentioned the name Follings. Elias and Martha were there, a marriage recorded in 1938, property deeds for the homestead parcel, tax payments made in cash until the early 1960s, then nothing. No death certificates, no probate. But it was the children she had asked about specifically. 12 mouths to feed, 12 bodies growing year by year, surely there would be something. School census forms, perhaps, or welfare visits, or at the very least birth registrations. The archivist had searched every volume, every card index, even the unofficial stray notes file where unfiled scraps sometimes ended up. Nothing. Not a single entry. No births, no adoptions, no out-of-state transfers. The deputy had shrugged, half amused, half uncomfortable. Folks up that way kept to themselves, he'd said. Probably homeschooled. Or maybe they just never bothered with the paperwork. But Evelyn knew better. In mid-century rural Maine, large families did not simply appear without leaving some trace in the bureaucratic net, especially not 12 children spanning more than a decade. Now, sitting in the house those children had supposedly lived in, she felt the full weight of that absence settle over her like frost. The blank certificates she had found on the shelf were pristine, as though waiting for names that never came. The handwritten tallies of new arrivals offered no clues to hospitals, no orphanage stamps, no court decrees. She lined up the photographs again, counting faces, matching features across years. A boy with a jagged scar over one eyebrow appeared in 1952 and was gone by 1955, replaced by another boy of similar height but softer mouth. A girl whose left hand seemed slightly withered in one image simply ceased to appear, with no gap in the arrangement to suggest mourning or mention. The realization crept in slowly, cold and certain. These children had no documented beginning. Whatever path had brought them to this isolated clearing had been deliberately erased, every paper trail severed before it could reach the outside world. Elias and Martha had not merely avoided bureaucracy, they had constructed a family that, on paper, did not exist at all. Outside, the wind rose, threading through the pines with a sound almost like breathing. Evelyn's flashlight flickered once, then steadied, but the shadows in the corners seemed to deepen, pressing closer as if the cabin itself resented the questions forming in her mind. She sat very still, listening to the creak of old timber and the faint, persistent rustle beyond the walls, while the truth took root. Whatever the Follings had been hiding, it was not negligence or backwards eccentricity. It was something far more deliberate, far darker, and the absence of those 12 birth records was only the first, thinnest layer of a secret that had waited decades to be disturbed. Evelyn remained in the rocking chair long after the last sliver of daylight vanished, unwilling to leave the cabin while the weight of her discovery still pressed against her chest. The flashlight beam trembled slightly in her hand, less from cold than from the realization that she was alone in a place that had been designed to keep secrets. She told herself she would leave soon, just one more look at the photographs, one more page of the cryptic notes, but the hours slipped away, and the forest outside grew darker than any city night she had ever known. When she finally stood, the floorboards protested with a low, reluctant groan. She gathered the papers back into a loose stack, intending to carry them to her jeep for closer study, when the first sound reached her. It was faint, almost lost beneath the rustle of leaves against the cabin walls, but unmistakable, a voice. Not the wind, not an animal. A human voice, soft and distant, murmuring words she could not yet distinguish. She froze, head tilted toward the door, heart suddenly loud in her ears. The sound came again, closer this time, drifting through the trees from somewhere beyond the clearing. It sounded like a child, several children, perhaps speaking in low, overlapping tones, the syllables blending into a soft, mournful chorus. Evelyn stepped to the window and cupped her hands around her eyes, peering into the blackness. Nothing moved. The pines stood in perfect stillness, their needles silvered by moonlight that had only just begun to filter through the canopy. Yet the voices continued, circling the cabin like smoke, sometimes rising in pitch, sometimes falling to a whisper that seemed to press directly against the glass. She recognized no language, only fragments of sound that might have been names, or pleas, or warnings. One voice, a girl's, high and clear, repeated something like Elias, please, before trailing into a sigh that raised the hair on Evelyn's arms. Another, deeper, answered with a single word she almost caught, stay. The voices wove together and apart, never quite forming sentences, yet carrying an unmistakable sense of longing, as though they had been calling for years and had only now found someone to hear them. Evelyn's breath fogged the window pane. She told herself it was a trick of acoustics, the wind carrying echoes from the valley below, or perhaps a radio left on somewhere far away. But the sounds felt intimate, personal, directed at her alone. She backed away from the glass, pulse hammering, and realized the cabin had grown colder, as if the night itself had slipped inside. She turned off the flashlight to save the battery, plunging the room into darkness broken only by faint moonlight through the cracks. The voices grew bolder, no longer distant but right at the edge of the porch, murmuring names, her name, she thought for a moment, though that was impossible, and then retreating, only to circle back again. They spoke of things long buried, of nights when the children had lain awake listening to the same whispers, of a promise made in the dark that had never been kept. Evelyn stood motionless, flashlight clutched like a weapon, while the unseen chorus filled the clearing, calling from the woods in tones that were at once mournful and hungry, as though the forest itself had remembered her presence and decided it was time to speak. That night Evelyn did not leave the cabin. The voices outside had faded with the moon's slow climb, retreating into the trees as if satisfied with their warning, but the darkness felt too vast, the path back to her jeep too uncertain. She barricaded the door with the rocking chair, spread her sleeping bag on the floorboards near the stove, and lay down fully clothed, flashlight within reach. Exhaustion pulled at her, yet sleep came in uneasy fragments, the kind that blur the line between waking and dreaming. In the dream she was still in the cabin, but the room was alive with lamplight and movement. The stove crackled with a fresh fire, casting long, wavering shadows across the walls. Elias and Martha stood near the table, backs turned, their silhouettes sharp against the glow. Between them and the hearth gathered the children, 12 pale figures in nightgowns, barefoot on the cold planks, arranged in a loose semicircle. Their faces were clearer here than in any photograph, hollow cheeks, eyes too large, mouths set in identical solemn lines. None spoke, yet the air thrummed with anticipation. Martha held something small in her cupped hands, lifting it toward the firelight so the flames glinted off its surface, a tarnished silver locket, or perhaps a pendant, swinging gently from a thin chain. Elias murmured words Evelyn could not quite catch, low and rhythmic, like a prayer or an incantation. The children swayed in unison, tiny movements that matched the cadence of his voice. One by one they stepped forward, each placing a hand upon whatever Martha offered, fingers lingering as though drawing warmth or strength from it. The youngest, a boy no older than 4, hesitated, eyes wide with fear, until Elias reached down and pressed the child's palm firmly against the object. A soft sigh escaped the circle, almost one of relief. Shadows thickened at the edges of the room, coiling upward like smoke, forming vague shapes that hovered just beyond the lamplight's reach. Evelyn felt them watching, patient and ancient, as the ritual unfolded. Martha began to sing, wordless, a low humming that rose and fell with the fire's crackle, and the children joined her, their voices blending into the same mournful chorus Evelyn had heard outside. The sound wrapped around her, pulling her deeper into the scene until she stood among them, unseen yet present, her own breath syncing with theirs. Elias raised his head then, gazing directly toward the spot where Evelyn lay in her sleeping bag, as though he could sense her there across the decades. His lips moved again, forming a single clear phrase that cut through the humming, no beginning, no end. The shadows surged forward, swallowing the lamplight, and the children's faces turned toward her all at once, eyes gleaming with something between plea and hunger. The dream shattered as Evelyn jolted awake, heart pounding against her ribs. The cabin was pitch black, the fire long cold, yet the echo of that humming lingered in her ears, and the air carried the faint, unmistakable scent of wood smoke that had no source. She lay rigid, staring at the invisible ceiling, while the memory of those shadowy figures and their silent ritual pressed against her mind, refusing to fade with morning light that had not yet come. Morning light filtered weakly through the grimy windows, painting the cabin in muted greys as Evelyn stirred from her restless sleep. The dream's residue clung to her like damp fog, the humming voices, the swaying children, Elias's piercing gaze, but the practical historian in her pushed it aside. She needed evidence, something tangible beyond photographs and blank forms. Coffee from her thermos steadied her hands as she returned to the cluttered table, determined to search more thoroughly before the forest swallowed another day. She began with the shelves again, running gloved fingers along the undersides, feeling for hidden compartments. Nothing. Then the floorboards near the stove, one lifted slightly when she pressed her weight, loose in a way the others were not. Kneeling, she pried it up with the blade of her multi-tool, revealing a shallow cavity packed with oilskin-wrapped bundles. Her breath caught as she unwrapped the first, a small leather-bound journal, its cover cracked and darkened by time, pages warped from moisture yet still legible. The handwriting was Martha's, neat, slanted, economical. The earliest entries were mundane, weather notes, preserves put up, cords of wood stacked. But as Evelyn turned deeper, the tone shifted. An entry dated October 1947 read, "See arrived after midnight." Small for her age, quiet. No papers, as agreed. Elias carried her from the truck himself. She slept through the naming. Another, winter 1951, M&J together this time. The driver would take nothing but the envelope. They clung to each other until we pried them apart. Better that way, no memories to share later. Each arrival followed the same pattern, a season, an initial, the hour always past midnight. No mention of agencies, no fees recorded beyond vague envelopes, no descriptions of the children's condition beyond quiet or frightened or, chillingly, empty-eyed. One passage, dated spring 1954, made Evelyn pause. The boy with the scar asked today where he came from. Elias told him the woods birthed him, same as the rest. He seemed to accept it, but I saw the doubt. We must be more careful. The voices grow restless when questions are asked. Further on, Martha wrote of nights when headlights would creep up the logging road without sound, stopping just beyond the tree line. Elias would go out alone, lantern dimmed, and return with a child wrapped in a blanket, sometimes two. No driver ever stepped into the light, no words were exchanged beyond a nod. The children arrived clean but unmarked, no bruises, no signs of travel, as though they had materialized at the edge of the clearing. Martha recorded giving them new names immediately, burning whatever scraps of clothing they wore, washing away any scent of elsewhere. Evelyn read on, the journal's pages whispering as she turned them, while pale light crept across the floor. The entries grew shorter toward the end, the ink fainter, as if Martha's strength had waned. The final one, barely legible, read, "They say the price comes due. The voices promise it. Elias laughs, but I hear them calling the children by names we never gave." She closed the journal carefully, pulse thrumming in her temples. The arrivals were not adoptions, not in any legal or human sense. They were collections, deliberate and repeated, sourced from darkness and delivered under cover of night. Whatever path those children had traveled to reach the Follings homestead had been engineered to leave no trace, no origin, no possibility of return. The woods had not merely hidden the family, they had supplied it, one silent child at a time, in exchanges whose terms were only hinted at in Martha's careful, terrified script. Evelyn left the cabin at mid-morning, journal tucked securely in her backpack, the weight of Martha's words pressing against her spine as she followed a faint trail downhill toward the valley. The voices had not returned with the light, but the forest felt watchful, branches knitting overhead to dim the sun into fractured patches. She needed context beyond the homestead, someone who remembered the Follings without the haze of decades. The nearest settlement was a cluster of weathered houses and a general store that doubled as post office and gossip hub. She found it after 2 hours of walking, boots caked in mud, breath visible in the sharp air. The store smelled of wood smoke and coffee grounds. A bell jingled as she entered, drawing the attention of the only occupant, an old man behind the counter, lean and stooped, skin like bark, eyes sharp beneath a faded Red Sox cap. He introduced himself as Harlan Crow, 91 years come spring, born and raised within sight of these same pines. When Evelyn mentioned the Follings homestead, his fingers paused on the cash register keys, and the room seemed to grow quieter. Harlan poured her coffee without asking, black and strong, then leaned on the counter as if the telling required support. Folks in town had always known the Follings were strange, he said, Elias trading pelts and firewood for supplies, Martha coming down maybe twice a year, face half hidden under a shawl. But it was the children that unsettled people most. Pale, silent, never seen in school or church. Some said they were kin from away, others whispered worse things after the disappearances started. He spoke of youngsters gone missing over the years, runaways, mostly, from broken homes farther south, hitchhikers cutting through the back roads. A girl in 49, 2 boys in 52, another pair in the late 50s. None ever found. Search parties scoured the woods, dogs baying until they reached the ridge above the Follings place, then going suddenly quiet, tails tucked, refusing to go farther. Harlan himself had been on one such party. He remembered the way the air thickened, the sudden drop in birdsong, as though the forest itself warned them away. The land up there was cursed long before Elias built his cabin, Harlan continued, voice dropping. Old Penobscot stories spoke of a clearing where voices lured travelers deeper, promising rest or riches, only to lead them in circles until they vanished. Elias laughed at such tales, or so Martha once told Harlan's wife during a rare visit to the store. But after the children began arriving, things changed. Lights seen flickering on moonless nights, smoke rising when no wind stirred. And the voices, Harlan had heard them himself once, driving the logging road at dusk, soft calls that sounded like his own name spoken by someone long dead. He fixed Evelyn with a steady gaze then, the weight of 91 winters behind it. Whatever pact Elias made, whatever price he thought he could pay, the woods always collect. The Follings stopped coming to town altogether by 62. No one went up to check. Folks figured they'd moved on or passed quiet-like. But the disappearances stopped too, as if the debt had been settled. Harlan's hand trembled slightly as he refilled her cup. Some debts, he said, don't end with death. They just wait for the next fool to stumble close enough to hear the calling. Evelyn listened without interrupting, the coffee growing cold in her grip, while Harlan's words settled over her like the first flakes of an approaching storm, confirming that the silence around the Follings had never been natural, it had been enforced, paid for in lives that left no trace, bound to a curse older than any ledger or LAWTS. The days blurred in the shadow of the homestead, Evelyn found herself returning to the cabin each dawn, drawn by an compulsion she could no longer dismiss as mere academic curiosity. The journal entries had unlocked something. The woods seemed to sense it. Nights grew heavier, the air thick with the scent of pine resin and something older, like turned earth after rain. And the voices, no longer faint or distant, began to weave themselves into every quiet moment, rising as the sun dipped below the ridgeline. At first they came in fragments, snatched phrases carried on the wind, a child's laughter cut short, a whispered mother that dissolved into rustling leaves. But with each passing evening the chorus clarified, layering over itself in a mournful harmony that pressed against the cabin walls. Evelyn would sit by the cold stove, recorder running, capturing snatches of sound that played back as overlapping murmurs, some pleading, some accusing, all laced with a profound, aching isolation. One dusk, as fog rolled in from the valley and cloaked the clearing in grey, the voices grew bold enough to form coherent threads. She heard a girl, perhaps the one initialed C from 1947, recounting in a small, clear tone how the trees had seemed to part the night she arrived, how Elias's hands had felt like iron around her wrists. Another voice, a boy's, deeper and cracked with age beyond his years, spoke of lying awake in the loft, counting heartbeats to drown out the calling from below the floorboards. They described the fear that settled over the house like frost, doors that creaked without wind, shadows that lingered too long in corners, the way Martha's lullabies always ended on the same unresolved note. The stories spilled out in pieces, isolation enforced not just by distance but by something deliberate, a rule never spoken aloud, no questions about before, no tears for what was lost. They told of games played in whispers so the woods would not overhear, of nights when one among them would vanish from the shared bed, only to reappear at breakfast pale and silent, eyes emptied of whatever dream had claimed them. The voices overlapped in their telling of dread, the sense that the family was held together by something thinner than love, something that fed on their fear and grew stronger with each unanswered question. Evelyn listened from the porch as twilight deepened, the fog swallowing the tree line until the clearing felt like an island adrift. The chorus circled her now, no longer content to remain at the edge of hearing. They spoke of a binding, words not quite a promise, not quite a threat, made long ago to keep the family whole, to keep the children from drifting back to wherever they had been taken from. And woven through every fragment was the same undercurrent of unnatural patience, as though the voices had waited decades for someone to bear witness, someone whose presence might finally loosen the knot that held them in the dark. She sat motionless as the fog thickened and the temperature dropped, the voices rising and falling around her like breath, revealing in their fractured tales a portrait of a household suspended between the living world and something far older, where isolation was not protection but sustenance, and fear the only inheritance passed from one silent child to the next. Evelyn's hands shook as she replaced the loose floorboard over Martha's journal, the wood settling with a soft thud that echoed too loudly in the empty cabin. The voices had quieted at dawn, but their stories lingered, pressing her toward a thoroughness she now regretted. She needed more, something that would anchor the whispers in undeniable fact. A rusted axe head leaned in one corner, she used its blunt end to tap along the walls, listening for hollow spaces, then moved to the rear of the room where a narrow door, warped and half hidden by a sagging shelf, led to what she had assumed was a pantry. The door resisted at first, swollen with decades of damp, but gave way with a groan that scattered dust across her boots. Beyond lay a steep, narrow staircase descending into blackness, the air rising cool and thick with the smell of earth and something metallic. She hesitated only a moment before switching on her flashlight and starting down, each step creaking beneath her weight, the beam trembling across rough-hewn stone walls slick with moisture. The cellar was smaller than expected, a low-ceilinged chamber no larger than the cabin's main room, its floor packed dirt softened by time. Shelves lined the walls, but they held no jars or tools, only bundles wrapped in oilcloth and tied with twine, stacked neatly as if awaiting inspection. Evelyn knelt and unwrapped the nearest. Inside lay small relics, a child's woolen mitten stiffened with age, a lock of pale hair bound with faded ribbon, a wooden toy horse whittled smooth by tiny hands. Each bundle bore a single initial scratched into the cloth, matching those in Martha's journal. Deeper along the shelf she found items less innocent, scraps of clothing too small for adults, stained dark in places the light revealed as old blood, a stack of photographs identical to those upstairs but showing the children alone, posed against the cellar wall, eyes wide and vacant as if taken in the moment of arrival. One image showed a boy with fresh bruises blooming across his throat, another captured a girl clutching a torn blanket, her mouth open in what might have been a scream frozen by the flash. At the far end, beneath a loose stone in the floor, Evelyn uncovered a shallow metal box. Inside rested a ledger, Elias's handwriting, stark and angular, listing dates and brief notations, taken from the road south of Millinocket, 1953. No family claimed. Found wandering near the railway, 1956. Tongue cut to silence questions. Bought from the traveller for 2 bottles and a promise, 1959. The entries spanned years, each child catalogued not as adopted but seized, their pasts systematically erased, names changed, marks hidden, stories forbidden. The beam of her flashlight caught something glinting in the corner, a small silver pendant, identical to the one in her dream, its chain tangled around a child's shoe long rotted to leather scraps. Evelyn reached for it, fingers brushing cold metal, and in that instant the air shifted, growing heavier, as though the cellar itself exhaled. The relics scattered across the shelves seemed to watch her, silent witnesses to deliberate theft disguised as family, origins not merely undocumented but violently severed, leaving 12 children bound to a house that had never truly been a home. Evelyn emerged from the cellar with the ledger clutched against her chest, the silver pendant slipped into her pocket as evidence she could no longer ignore. The afternoon light felt thin and unreliable, as though the sun itself hesitated to touch the clearing. She meant to leave then, pack her notes, hike back to the jeep, drive until the trees thinned and cell service returned, but her legs carried her instead to the porch, where she sat heavily on the warped steps, staring at the relics spread across her lap. The air shifted without warning, a sudden drop in temperature that turned her breath to frost. The forest, which had murmured softly all week, fell into absolute silence, no wind, no bird call, only the thud of her own heart. Then the pendant grew warm against her thigh, a slow, insistent heat that spread like spilled blood. She reached for it instinctively, fingers closing around the metal just as a shape detached itself from the tree line. It was a child, or the echo of one. A girl, perhaps 10 years old, standing at the edge of the clearing in a threadbare nightgown that hung loose on her narrow frame. Her skin was translucent in the slanted light, veins faint blue beneath, and her eyes held the same wide, watchful stare Evelyn knew from every photograph. The girl's feet were bare, yet left no imprint on the damp earth. She raised one hand, palm outward, in a gesture that might have been greeting or restraint. Evelyn's mouth went dry. She tried to stand, but her body felt leaden, rooted to the step. The girl took a single step forward, then another, gliding more than walking, and as she neared, Evelyn recognized the faint braid falling over one shoulder. The girl initialed C in Martha's journal, the first arrival. Her lips moved, forming words without sound at first, until a voice, soft, cracked with disuse, reached Evelyn directly inside her skull. You weren't supposed to find it. Behind the girl, other shapes began to coalesce from the mist, 12 in all, materializing one by one at the forest's edge. Some smaller, some taller, all dressed in the same pale garments, all watching with identical pleading intensity. The boy with the jagged scar tilted his head, as though listening to instructions only he could hear. The youngest, the boy from the dream, clutched the hem of an older sibling's gown, eyes brimming with tears that never fell. The girl stopped an arm's length away, close enough that Evelyn could see the faint bruises circling her throat like fingerprints. Her expression shifted, sorrow, then something sharper, almost accusatory. We had no beginning, she whispered, the words echoing from every direction at once, as though spoken by the entire chorus. But you're giving us one now. Please, bury it again. The pendant burned hotter, searing through fabric against Evelyn's skin. She wanted to speak, to ask the questions burning in her mind where they had come from, what Elias had truly bargained for, but her voice caught, strangled by the weight of their collective gaze. The children began to move closer, encircling the porch in a slow, silent advance, their bare feet soundless on the grass. The girl reached out, fingers inches from Evelyn's knee, and in that moment Evelyn understood, they were not threatening her. They were begging. Begging her to stop digging, to leave the ledger unread, the pendant untouched, the truth sealed once more beneath the floorboards. Reality wavered at the edges, the clearing tilting as though the ground itself breathed. Evelyn's vision tunneled, fixed on those pleading faces, while the children's silent entreaty pressed against her like a physical force, urging her to forget, to walk away, to let the woods reclaim what had always belonged to them. The pendant seared through Evelyn's pocket like a coal pulled fresh from the fire, forcing her to her feet with a gasp that broke the silence of the clearing. The children halted their advance, faces flickering between relief and alarm, as though her pain had disrupted a delicate balance. But the heat only intensified, spreading upward until her vision blurred and the world tilted, the porch steps dropping away beneath her. She stumbled backward into the cabin, slamming the door against the encircled figures, but the barrier meant nothing. The air inside thickened, heavy with the scent of damp earth and the faint, sweet rot of long-buried things. Shadows uncoiled from the corners, rising like smoke to form the vague outlines she remembered from her dreams, tall, indistinct presences that hovered just beyond the reach of her flashlight's beam. The children's voices flooded the room now, no longer pleading but urgent, overlapping in a frantic chorus that echoed from the walls themselves. Evelyn clutched the ledger to her chest as the pendant burned hotter, forcing her to tear it free and hurl it across the floor. It landed with a metallic clink near the cellar door, spinning until it pointed toward the staircase like a compass needle. The shadows surged toward it, and in their wake the truth unfurled in her mind, not as words, but as a sudden, visceral understanding that rooted her in place. The Follings had not merely taken children. They had bargained for them. Elias, desperate for a family after years of barren isolation, had stood in this very clearing on a moonless night and spoken to the woods, not in prayer, but in transaction. The voices had answered, offering what he craved most, children without pasts, without claims, delivered in exchange for a promise. Not money, not blood in the simple sense, but something subtler and more enduring. The family itself would serve as anchor, their silence and isolation feeding the ancient hunger that lived beneath the pines. Each child bound the pact tighter, their erased origins sealing the debt, their fear nourishing whatever watched from the dark. But debts accumulate interest. The voices had grown restless as the children aged, whispering of endings Elias refused to acknowledge. Martha had sensed it first, the way the woods leaned closer each winter, the way dreams turned to summons. The disappearances in town had been down payments, small offerings to delay the reckoning. Yet the true price, the voices now revealed in a swelling chorus that shook dust from the rafters, was the family entire. Elias and Martha had vanished not by choice or death, but by collection, their souls woven into the canopy to hold the bargain in place. The children, too, had been claimed one by one, their spectral forms lingering as guardians, ensuring no outsider disturbed the seal. Evelyn understood now why they begged her to bury the truth. Her presence, her questions, her digging, the ledger and pendant in her hands, was unraveling the knot. Each revelation loosened their tether, drawing the ancient hunger downward, toward her. The shadows pressed closer, taking on weight and form, while the children's faces twisted in shared agony, mouths open in silent screams as the pact began to fracture. The cabin groaned around her, timbers shifting like bones, and the voices rose to a single, unified demand not for silence now, but for completion, calling her name into the curse that had waited patiently for fresh blood to renew it. The pendant glowed white-hot on the floorboards, the shadows reaching, and Evelyn felt the pull deepen, an irresistible tide dragging her toward the heart of the macabre agreement that had birthed a family with no beginning and, unless she joined them, no end.